January 1892. By the fourth day of the blizzard, Raven's Crossing was fading from the map. The storm had wiped it clean. Roofs bowed under crushing weight, barns disappeared under drifting snow, and families in town fed their last sticks of wood to dying fires. Still, a rumor threaded the whiteout. Somewhere high on the ridge, a light was holding. Half a mile above the buried streets, Gideon Mercer shut his ledger on a simple entry. Day 4, cabin, steady, at 65° air. The wind shrieked along the cliff. Inside, the stove murmured. Ruth dozed near the hearth. On the floorboards, Brass, the old cattle dog, lay unmoving, as if the mountain had already chosen the outcome. While the valley surrendered to winter, a cabin set in a granite alcove stayed calm, exactly as Gideon had intended. Months earlier, when claims were being drawn across fertile ground and along easy water, Gideon had pointed past them all to a rocky ridge above town. People laughed when he explained he would tuck a house into a natural recess of stone. Why choose a cliff over comfort? Because the cliff was the point. Gideon had hauled freight through Montana's high country for years. He'd watched wind split and fold, seen one shoulder of a ridge scoured bare while another heaped snow stories tall. He learned that some formations shaped the air into pockets of quiet, what he called the mountain's lee of silence. Ruth, daughter of a stonemason, understood another truth. Trapped moisture ruins wood long before cold does. When Gideon proposed using the alcove so the mountain, not the house, would carry winter's weight, she asked about drainage, studied his sketch, and said yes. When they climbed to the site, the place revealed itself. An opening turned to the southeast that welcomed morning sun, a stout overhang that made a natural roof, and a back wall of time-tested stone. Gideon traced wind eddies, read old snow stains in the cracks, and noted dry lichen where damp should have been. It all suggested one thing. Storms rarely entered that hollow head-on. He set the cabin not at the lip, but farther in, letting granite become the first defense. Ruth added a key detail. Raise the floor on stone piers so air could move beneath and keep ground moisture off the timbers. By sunset, a system existed in their minds. Mass for stability, sun for passive warmth, a wind shadow for protection, bound together by a modest frame. Word spread, and with it the jokes: mountain mole, stone hermit, mountain fool. Silas Voss, the county's richest rancher, declared the whole idea a costly hole in the rock. Elias Hart, the town's best builder, came with practical doubts. Stone sweats, timber rots, airflow stalls, ice forms, freeze-thaw presses. Gideon answered with routes for air, drainage paths, a lifted floor, and sheltering orientation. Hart left unconvinced, and his warning stayed with Gideon longer than the laughter. The work was relentless, every board hauled uphill, every tool carried by hand. A platform rose on stone piers, then heavy beams, then a frame against the granite. Ruth fixed boards from plank walkways while Gideon set roof members. A second inner wall went up with raw sheep's wool packed between for insulation. Behind the cabin, a small food cellar took shape, carved into protected earth, vented and shelved. Piece by piece, a system replaced spectacle. Autumn tested it. The cabin stayed warm on cold nights. The small stove sipped wood. Drafts were scarce. Then Gideon noticed a fine thread of moisture behind an interior board on the north side. Days later, it froze to a pale ribbon of ice. He opened the wall and found a dead pocket where warm air settled and chilled. He cut new vents, redirected airflow, moved insulation. The next cold snap left no frost. The mountain had given them a first lesson. A sound idea still has to earn its way in the real world. Gideon didn't measure success from the road. He measured it in numbers. Outside temp, inside temp, wind, wood consumed, logged morning and evening. The pattern was clear. The cabin used far less fuel than most homes in town, about 2/3 less by his count. Almost no one cared except Abigail Reed at the post office. She read the numbers without comment and returned them to the shelf. Late January brought signs Gideon recognized from old winters in rougher country. Crows leaving early, snow patterns on western slopes breaking their habits, wind that couldn't make up its mind, pressure falling hard. He rode into town to warn people. Some laughed, some rolled their eyes. The mayor cautioned Gideon not to make a spectacle of himself. Only Abigail asked, "When did you first notice?" and wrote down the date. Back at the ridge, Gideon and Ruth prepared with calm precision. Wood stacked, hinges oiled, barrels filled, feed moved, cellar stocked. Brass posted himself near the entrance, slipping out to stare at the valley and then returning wordless. At dusk, big flakes began to settle on the granite shelves. The storm arrived in one violent turn of the night. No ramp-up, just a sudden white wall and wind driving snow sideways. Temperatures plunged. Ice claimed anything exposed. Roads vanished first, then fences, then barn doors. Chimneys glazed over faster than families could clear them. In the alcove, the thermometer barely budged. The stove burned at the same steady pace the ledger showed before the storm. Warm air flowed as designed. The repaired walls stayed dry. Slate chewed hay in the shelter. Brass slept as if nothing extraordinary had happened. And that unsettled Gideon. The mountain wasn't fighting the blizzard. It was absorbing it. The storm felt less like weather and more like sustained force. At Voss's ranch, drifts climbed past windows and then the roofline. A barn failed in a crack and groan, and then silence under tons of snow. In town, Hart's ventilation iced, smoke backed up. Heat demanded constant labor. Woodpiles shrank, doors buried, men tunneled for fuel. Buildings that seemed frontier tough were being tested in ways they hadn't been built to endure. On the ridge, Gideon kept writing, date, Thames, wind, wood. The entries stayed almost identical. By the fourth afternoon, a dull knock reached the alcove. Brass stood first. Gideon opened the door into a blast of snow and pulled in two shapes, Elias Hart and his teenage son, faces bleached by cold, coats armored with ice. Their chimney had sealed with frost. The fire failed, and they had clawed a path through drifts by field and fence lines until instinct steered them to the mountain, the very place Hart had doubted. Wrapped in blankets, hands curling around hot tin cups, he finally said, rough and low, "You were right." Gideon only fed the fire and glanced at the door. He suspected more would come. They did. By the fifth day, the town understood that survival at home was no longer promised. In twos and threes, they materialized from the white. Mayor Crowley, schoolteacher Clara Whitlock, with frightened children, and two elders, families, and then more families, 31 souls by dusk. Inside the alcove, order replaced panic. Ruth rationed and warmed food. Abigail recorded each name by lantern light. Gideon issued wood by need, not rank. Outside, the storm was impartial. Inside, so were they. Children scratched Brass behind the ears and smiled for the first time in days. The nicknames were gone. The mountain's hole had become a community's refuge. Morning finally opened to silence. The valley lay blank and unrecognizable. Fences erased, roads gone, rooftops swallowed, livestock frozen where they'd been stranded. Search parties fanned out. The damage deepened with every shovel and rope. Nature had spent 5 days ordering choices. Some passed, many failed. The alcove stood almost unchanged, with 31 living witnesses to the difference. In the days that followed, apologies came, Voss, hat in hand, the mayor, the teacher, Hart. But the turning point wasn't in their words. It sat in Gideon's ledger. Abigail turned the pages while townspeople watched. Temperatures, wind, pressure, fuel, dates, conditions, month after month of consistent evidence, including during the worst of the blizzard. Arguments wilted beside the numbers. Hart, who had once arrived to list reasons the cabin would fail, asked quietly if he could measure everything: the spacing, the vents, the floor height, the principles. Curiosity had replaced doubt. A year later, Raven's Crossing had changed in ways small but telling. New homes tucked themselves into sheltering folds instead of open flats. Root cellars sat deeper. Windbreaks became common. Builders learned to read terrain before drawing plans. No one copied Gideon's alcove exactly. The site was unique, but the ideas spread. Pay attention to wind, snow, drainage, exposure. Let the land carry part of winter's load. Hart became a leading voice for winter-wise design. The mayor issued guidelines urging settlers to weigh prevailing winds, drift patterns, and natural shelter when staking claims. The blizzard's lessons moved from rumor to local practice. Seasons turned. Children grew. More storms came and went. Gideon and Ruth lived out their days beneath the granite lip. Brass aged beside them and was buried on a slope facing the entrance, watching, in his way, the valley he'd known through so many winters. When Gideon died, and then Ruth, the town fixed a modest bronze plaque at the alcove. He listened where others argued. The mountain answered. Decades on, visitors still step into the recess and feel something steady. Outside, weather is always changing. Inside, the air holds a near-timeless calm. Much like the day Gideon first stood there with a notebook, tracing wind that seemed to lose interest at that exact bend of stone. The insight was never his to own. It was in the mountain from the start. He was simply the one who took time to hear it.